The most exclusive private hospital on Chicago's Gold Coast fell into an uneasy silence as laughter echoed off marble walls. A mafia boss who controlled half the city's underworld stood frozen in the lobby while strangers whispered about his 6-year-old daughter, the little girl who hadn't spoken a single word since the day she was born. Her mother died bringing her into this world, and her father, a man whose name alone could make grown men kneel, couldn't buy her a voice no matter how many millions he buried in specialists and therapists. Inside that polished building, weakness wasn't tolerated. Outside, a 12-year-old homeless girl was shoved away by security, her ribs sharp beneath a torn jacket, her eyes long accustomed to being invisible, as though she didn't exist at all. But she slipped back in anyway. From a ragged cloth pouch hidden under her shirt, she pressed a strange, bitter leaf into the little girl's small hand. The laughter grew louder as onlookers raised their phones to record the homeless girl being shoved away. In the middle of the noise, the child's throat tightened, and a sound thin and broken struggled to escape her lips. But it was instantly swallowed by the heavy thud of the closing security doors. And in that instant, the poorest child in the room became the most dangerous truth no one wanted revealed. Before we continue, drop a like if you believe kindness can change everything. Share this with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. Now let's go back to the morning it all began, when a black SUV pulled up to the hospital entrance, and the man they called Reese Callahan stepped out with his silent daughter into the cold Chicago wind. That morning, Chicago woke beneath a sheet of gray mist clinging to the surface of Lake Michigan like a burial shroud. The wind sliced through the streets of the Gold Coast, carrying a cold sharp enough to numb the skin within seconds. The black SUV glided through the packed traffic, its engine rumbling low like the breathing of a patient beast. Reese Callahan sat in the back seat, his eyes fixed on his own reflection in the darkened window. That reflection showed a man of 36 in a tailored suit, jaw set hard, shoulders straight, a name that made half of Chicago's underworld bow its head. But that reflection didn't show the dull pain grinding deep inside his chest, the feeling he had refused to name for 6 years. He checked his phone. 4 missed calls from Barrett Kane, 2 messages about the meeting with the allied families on the south side of the city. The reminder flashed across the screen. Family meeting, 11:30 in the morning. That day demanded strength, sharpness, absolute dominance. Beside him, Eloise sat in silence, her small hands folded neatly in her lap. Her eyes wandered, catching each bare tree slipping past the glass, each faint ribbon of light breaking through the winter clouds. She didn't ask where they were going. She never asked. Silence was her first language, her only language, and it had wrapped itself around her so completely that people often forgot there was still a child living inside it. Reese lifted a hand as if to touch her, then stopped. He adjusted his cuff instead of reaching for the little girl. The hospital rose ahead, glaring white and imposing, guarded by uniformed security staff who straightened the moment the SUV approached. Reese gave a single nod, a habit formed after years of being recognized everywhere he went. The door opened. The cold outside air was replaced by conditioned stillness, by the smell of antiseptic mixed with the smell of money. They were escorted quickly through the lobby toward the private pediatric wing reserved for priority cases. Nurses moved briskly, their eyes flicking toward Reese with that uneasy mixture of respect and caution. Everyone knew who he was. Everyone knew his daughter. Whispers clung to them like a second shadow. That's the Callahan girl. She still hasn't spoken. Poor thing. So much money. Eloise could feel the stares even if she couldn't hear the words. Her shoulders tightened. Her steps slowed. Reese noticed and placed one light hand against her back, guiding her forward without looking into her eyes. Because looking into Eloise's eyes meant facing the question he didn't have an answer for. Why his daughter, the only child he had in this world, the child whose mother had traded her life to bring her into it, had chosen silence as if there was nothing in this world worth saying. Outside the hospital, right where the sidewalk began to crack and weeds pushed up through the seams in the concrete, Juniper Wren sat curled in on herself with her knees drawn to her chest. She was 12 years old, but looked 9 or 10 because her body had never been fed enough to grow the way it should have. Her coat was torn at the elbows, and her sneakers were worn so thin at the soles that she could feel every pebble beneath her feet. June had memorized the invisible boundaries of places like this a long time ago. The line where security stopped chasing because chasing any farther wasn't worth the effort. The line where donors stopped looking because if they looked any longer, they'd have to feel uncomfortable. Her stomach burned with hunger, that familiar pain rising and fading like the tide. She had been here since before the morning had fully broken. A hospital was a good place to find leftover food if you knew exactly where to stand. Sometimes a nurse would slip her a bread roll. Sometimes a driver would drop a coin without even bothering to look at her. Today, there had been nothing. When the black SUV glided into the lot, June looked up. She had seen cars like that before. They always carried trouble. Men with cold eyes, the kind who didn't like being slowed down by the existence of children like her. June made herself smaller when the guard shifted his stance, suddenly alert. But then, she saw the little girl. Eloise stepped out beside the man, small and careful, her eyes wide with a kind of fear June recognized instantly. Not the fear of being chased away or hit, the fear of being looked at, judged, measured against what you didn't have. June's breath caught. For one moment, the noise of the city seemed to fall away. She forgot her hunger. That little girl didn't speak. June knew it right away. It was there in the stillness of her mouth, in the way her eyes did all the work. The adults around her spoke near her, spoke over her head, spoke about her. The girl listened with her whole body. Inside the waiting room, Eloise sat beside her father. Through the glass wall, she looked outside, and her eyes landed on June. The two children looked at each other through a pane of glass separating two different worlds. June slowly lifted her hand, a tiny, hesitant wave, not even understanding herself why she was doing it. Eloise parted her lips, no sound coming out, and lifted her hand to wave back, mirroring June's gesture, as if it were the only language they both understood. A security guard stepped into view, blocking Eloise from sight. June lowered her hand, her heart sinking, and turned away before someone could order her to leave again. Inside, Eloise's chest tightened. The room suddenly felt smaller. The television noise pressed against her ears. She tugged lightly at her father's sleeve, trying to point outside, trying to explain something that had no words. Reese glanced down, his eyes still fixed on the phone screen where Barrett Kane's name was lighting up once again. "What is it, sweetheart?" he asked, his voice split between his daughter and the meeting. Eloise's hand fell back into her lap. She looked at the floor. Outside, June sat back down and pulled a small cloth pouch from inside her coat. Inside were a few dried leaves wrapped carefully, thin and brittle as dead butterfly wings. Her grandmother's voice echoed back through memory from the little house in West Virginia, where the red earth had been soft beneath bare feet and the air had hung heavy with the smell of wild plants. Her grandmother used to say, "The earth gives in silence, child. You have to know how to listen." These leaves weren't for curing sickness. They were for waking the body when fear or shock had locked something up inside. She remembered the steady rhythm of her grandmother's weathered hands, a soft echo from a time before her world had grown so quiet and cold. Back then, June hadn't fully understood the weight of the lessons hidden in those wild plants, but she knew this was the only piece of home she had left to share. The hospital doors slid open, and laughter spilled out as a group of wealthy visitors stepped outside. June drew in on herself again, invisible once more. But something inside her had changed. A thin, fragile thread had been pulled taut between two children who didn't belong to the worlds they had been born into. June looked through the glass at the little girl's eyes one last time, remembering the way they had asked a question without asking it. She rose to her feet, brushed the dirt from her hands, and started moving toward the entrance. The guard had turned his back, distracted by a delivery truck that had just pulled in. June quickened her pace, her heart pounding hard, knowing she had been thrown out for far less than this many times before. But that little girl's eyes were still waiting on the other side of the glass, and June couldn't turn away. Chaos didn't arrive all at once. It seeped in slowly, carrying sharp voices and hurried footsteps, swelling from confusion into something larger, something harder to control. A nurse rushed forward, her shoes skidding across the polished stone floor. "What did she eat?" she demanded, her hand already reaching for Eloise's wrist. Another nurse came running behind her, calling out vital signs. Someone hit the button on the wall, summoning support before anyone had time to explain why. The security guard tightened his grip on June's arm. She gasped as his fingers dug into her skin, fear flaring hot and fast through her body. "I didn't hurt her," June said, her voice shaking but clear. "I swear I didn't." "Be quiet," the guard snapped, yanking her backward. Eloise coughed once, dry and sudden. The sound scraped through her throat, strange and painful. She winced, her eyes filling with tears. Instinctively, she reached toward the empty space where June had been standing only seconds before. "Wait," Reese said sharply. finally finding his voice again. "Let the girl go." The guard hesitated, startled by the command. Colette Ashford appeared at the end of the corridor, her heels striking the marble floor with sharp clicks like blades. Her eyes swept across the room, displeasure written into every line of her face. "Reese," she said, her voice sharp and impatient. "Reese, don't be foolish. She fed your daughter something. You don't know what it was." She turned to the guard. "Call the police. Right now." "It was only a leaf," June whispered desperately. "A bitter leaf. My grandma." "Enough," Colette cut in. "Do you think a story is going to make this acceptable?" Dr. Forrest Hale arrived, parting the crowd with professional calm. His eyes moved quickly over the scene. Eloise's flushed face, the crushed leaf on the floor, the little girl being held in place. "Step back," he said firmly. "Everyone." He checked Eloise's throat, listened to her heartbeat, took her pulse. After a moment, he said, "She's fine. Uncomfortable, but fine." A ripple of murmuring moved through the onlookers, but she made a sound. Someone whispered. "That doesn't mean anything," Colette said quickly, clinging to control. "Children make noises all the time." Dr. Hale glanced at her. "This child doesn't," he said calmly. "Not like that." Barrett Kane's voice cut through the tension, smooth and controlled. He appeared quietly, drawn in by the noise. "Reese," he said, placing a hand on Reese's shoulder in a gesture that looked meant to soothe. "Let me handle this. The last thing you need is a scandal." Reese shrugged his hand off. "This is my daughter. And this is a private hospital," Barrett replied gently. "That girl has no right to be here." Meanwhile, security dragged June farther away. She looked back over her shoulder, trying to find Eloise among the adults crowding around her. And on the other side of the corridor, Eloise felt that absence. She looked around, her eyes frantic as she searched for the long-haired girl in the torn coat. She couldn't see her. She slipped off the examination bed, her bare feet hitting the cold floor, and ran. "Eloise," a nurse cried out in alarm. She didn't stop. She saw movement at the end of the corridor. Uniforms, adult bodies, a glimpse of June's ragged coat. She ran toward it, her heart pounding, her breath burning in her throat. Reese turned just in time to see his daughter rushing down the hall. "Eloise!" he shouted, fear breaking through his voice. He moved quickly, catching up and lifting her into his arms before she could reach the guard. Eloise struggled, gentle but desperate. She pointed toward June. Her eyes pleaded so fiercely it hurt to look at them. Reese followed the direction of his daughter's finger. He saw June being held between two security guards, as if she were a threat. He saw the girl's face, pale, terrified, but stubborn. And then Eloise made a sound again, this time louder. It came out broken and painful, but unmistakably deliberate. Not a cry, not a reflex. It was will, raw and desperate, forced through the throat of a child who had been silent for 6 years. The corridor froze. Everyone stared at the mute little girl making sound for the sake of the girl they were dragging away. Barrett stopped mid-step. Colette lifted a hand to cover her mouth. The guard loosened his grip without realizing he was doing it. And Reese Callahan stood there with his daughter in his arms, realizing that the next choice he made would define not only his reputation or his power, but the kind of father he truly was. "No one," he said, his voice low and steady as steel, "is taking that girl anywhere until I understand what really happened." The security room was small enough to make fear feel deafening. June sat on a plastic chair with a crack running straight down the middle, her hands clasped tightly in her lap as if holding them together might keep everything else from falling apart. The ceiling fan rattled overhead, pushing warm air in slow, circling turns. A security guard stood near the door, glancing at his phone again and again, impatient as though the girl's very presence had interrupted his workday. The hospital administrator stood in front of June with a clipboard raised like a shield. "Your full name," he said. "And where did you get that leaf?" June swallowed. "Juniper Wren," she said. "I got it from my bag. I carry it with me." "Where do you live?" "I don't have a fixed place," June admitted, her voice quiet. "Around here." The administrator's expression hardened. "So you're homeless?" June didn't answer. Her silence wasn't guilt. It was survival. She had learned that every truth could become a weapon in the wrong hands. Outside the security room, Barrett Kane stood speaking quietly with the hospital administrator, his voice even, as though he were arranging a lunch meeting instead of deciding the fate of a child. No papers, no guardian, no file. He nodded slowly, his eyes narrowing with calculation. Information like that meant the girl could disappear, and no one would ask a single question. No one would go looking for something the world had never bothered to admit existed. Barrett pulled out his phone, turned his back to the corridor, and made a short call. His voice was low and precise. "The leaf from the hallway floor. Take it. Replace it with another sample. A lab sample, the kind with contaminants." He paused, listening. "Yes. Right now, before anyone has time to send it for testing." He ended the call, smoothed his tie, and turned back toward the corridor with the calm smile of a man who had just cleaned up a mess. The door to the security room opened, and Colette Ashford walked in as though she owned the air inside it. She didn't sit down. She didn't greet anyone. Her eyes went straight to June, sweeping over the torn coat, the worn shoes, the thin arms. Colette's face hardened with the kind of disgust born from fear disguised as arrogance. "So this is the girl," Colette said. June lifted her head slightly. Her eyes were tired, but they didn't drop. Colette glanced at the clipboard. No address, no guardian, no papers. She read aloud, then looked back at June. "You know what you've done, don't you?" June's throat tightened. "I didn't hurt her," she said. She was scared. "I only wanted to help." Colette let out a sharp laugh. "Help. You broke into a private facility and fed a Callahan child, something from an unknown source. Do you think kindness excuses stupidity?" June's hands trembled. "It wasn't strange," she whispered. "It was bitter leaf. My grandma." "Your grandmother means nothing here," Colette cut in. "You're a stranger, a street child, and you touched a Callahan child." The word touched fell heavily, like an accusation of violence. June shrank back in the chair, clutching the arm where the guard's fingers had left red marks. Outside the security room, the story had already begun writing itself across the hospital lobby. Visitors whispered. Phones lifted discreetly at chest height. A nurse passing by caught fragments. "Homeless girl, poisoning, Mafia Boss's daughter," and shook her head without ever asking what was true. In the pediatric wing, Reese sat beside Eloise's bed, where she had been laid down again, exhausted. Doctor Hale had just stepped outside to confer with another physician. Reese looked at his daughter and remembered the second sound that had broken from her in the corridor. The way she had struggled in his arms, the way her tiny finger had pointed toward June with a desperation he had never seen in her before. He pulled out his phone and called Pierce Alderman. His voice was low and left no room for argument. "I need you to contact DCFS right now. There's a minor being held here without a guardian and without legal representation. Under Illinois law, no one questions that girl unless a child protection officer is present." He ended the call and looked back at Eloise. She was asleep, but her brow was still furrowed, as though she were still trying, even in her dreams. Late that night, when the hospital had sunk into the slow breathing rhythm of machines and overnight footsteps, Mrs. Helen Tierney arrived. She entered the temporary room where June had been moved after Reese's order forced the hospital to treat her as a child in need of protection instead of a criminal. She introduced herself with quiet respect and listened more than she spoke. June told her everything. About the leaf, about her grandmother, about the little girl's eyes through the glass. She told it in an even voice, without crying, without begging, like someone speaking the truth because it was the only thing she had. Mrs. Tierney nodded slowly. "You're very brave," she said. "But brave doesn't mean you won't be tested." June looked up. "Are they going to send me away?" Mrs. Tierney didn't lie. "They may try," she answered, "but they won't do it in silence." Night fell over Chicago with a false kind of peace. From the window of the pediatric wing, the city lights looked almost gentle, blinking patiently as traffic thinned and the air turned colder. But inside the hospital, nothing was calm at all. Reese Callahan sat alone beside Eloise's bed, the steady beeping of the monitor punctuating the silence. Eloise slept restlessly, her brow tightening now and then as if her dreams were crowded with effort. Reese watched every breath, every small movement, afraid that if he looked away, something important would slip past him again. He thought about all the files he had signed over the years. Therapy plans, specialist referrals, consent forms, each page a promise that he would fix the thing he couldn't bear to face. He had paid for the best people, demanded progress reports, attended a few sessions when his schedule allowed. Then he had gone back to meetings where his daughter's condition was discussed like a liability, a footnote, a weakness to be managed. "Your leadership has to look solid," Barrett had told him years ago. "The Allied families don't like instability." Reese had nodded then, grateful for the clarity of the advice. He had learned how to keep his voice even, how to sidestep questions, how to smile through pitying looks. He had learned how to let silence do the work for him. His daughter's silence, controlled and neatly managed. Now that clarity tasted like ashes in his mouth. Eloise turned and gave a soft whimper, a tiny sound of discomfort. Reese leaned in at once, instinctively. "It's all right," he whispered. "Daddy's here." Eloise's eyes opened halfway. She looked around in confusion, then found her father. Relief softened her face. She curled her fingers lightly around one of his. Reese felt his chest tighten. "I know," he whispered, though he wasn't sure what exactly he meant to say. "I know you're tired. I know you hurt. I know I should have done better." Eloise swallowed, her throat moving. She lifted a hand and touched it, cautious, curious. She made a sound, almost too faint to hear. A rough breath shaped by will. It scraped and faltered, but it was there. Reese felt tears sting without warning. He turned his face away for a moment, ashamed of the relief. He had cried in closed rooms before, quietly, privately, behind shut doors. But this was different. This felt earned. Across the hall, June lay awake on the temporary bed in the counseling room that had been converted for the night. Mrs. Tierney had arranged it, insisting that June remain under supervision for her own safety. June understood those words well enough to know they carried more weight than comfort. She stared at the ceiling, listening to the strange, steady hum of hospital electricity. Her body hurt now more from tension than from hunger. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the security guard's hand reaching for her, heard the snap in Colette Ashford's voice. She touched the empty pouch inside her coat. The leaves were gone. It left her feeling strangely hollow not to have them, as if she had given away more than a plant, as if she had handed over a piece of her grandmother's voice. In memory, her grandmother was always busy. Her hands moved with purpose, sorting leaves, rubbing stems between her fingers, lifting each one to the light as if it were a question waiting for an answer. She was never in a hurry. "People think healing is a miracle," she used to say. "It isn't. It's patience. It's timing. And it's knowing when to do nothing at all." That was before the illness came, before the house emptied out and was sold, before June learned how quickly grown-ups could disappear, leaving behind quiet rooms and unfinished sentences. The city didn't care about maps or memories. It swallowed her whole without bothering to chew. A soft knock came at the door. Petra Vaughn leaned her head inside. "Are you awake?" she asked gently. June nodded. Petra stepped in and closed the door behind her. She handed June a neatly folded blanket and a sandwich wrapped in foil. "It gets cold at night," Petra said. June accepted the blanket carefully and wrapped it around her shoulders. "Thank you," she said. Petra hesitated, then pulled up a chair and sat down. "I want you to know something," she said quietly. "I saw what happened. Not just today. The way they looked at you." June shrugged and pulled the blanket tighter. "They're always like that." Petra shook her head. "Not everyone is," she said. "And not always." June looked at her with doubt, but didn't argue. Petra went on, her voice dropping lower. "I've worked here a long time. I've seen what real danger looks like. You're not a threat." June's throat tightened. She didn't trust praise. It was usually followed by disappointment, but there was something steady in Petra's voice. Not empty comfort, but practical observation. "They'll still blame me," June said. "Maybe," Petra admitted, "but something isn't right here." June looked at her, waiting. Petra said, "Like how fast they decided you were guilty." June absorbed that in silence. She had never thought that speed itself could be a clue. And outside, in the darkness of the hospital parking lot, Barrett Kane sat in his car with the phone pressed to his ear, his voice low and exact. He was speaking to a number overseas. "Constantine," he said. "It's time. Come to Chicago. We have a mess that needs to be cleaned up." The next morning arrived without asking permission. Winter sunlight filtered through the window of the temporary room, thin and pale, as if even it wasn't sure it had the right to be there. June woke to footsteps outside the door, and the low but unmistakable voices of people who had already made up their minds before walking in. The door opened. A man in a gray suit stepped inside, his face polite but detached, the kind of politeness with no warmth in it. He carried a slim briefcase and a neat stack of papers. Mrs. Tierney sat beside June, her back straight, her eyes watchful. "I represent the Callahan family," the man said. "We'd like to settle this quietly." June's shoulders stiffened. "Settle it how?" He opened the briefcase and laid the papers on the table. Inside were pages of documents already signed at the bottom. "You admit that you trespassed and acted recklessly. In exchange, all charges disappear. You receive cash and a Greyhound bus ticket out of Chicago tonight." "Leave Chicago," June repeated. "Tonight," he confirmed. June looked at the paper. She imagined that bus, the worn fabric seats, the streetlights sliding past the window, the familiar emptiness of starting over somewhere new where no one knew her name. She had ridden buses like that before. She knew their smell, hot plastic and loneliness. Then she thought of Eloise's eyes, the way they had looked at her through the glass, the way that small hand had lifted in a wave, the way the little girl's throat had tightened and forced out the sound the whole world said was impossible. "No," June said quietly. The man blinked. "No." June looked him straight in the eye. "Because if I lie, then the sound she made won't mean anything. I won't turn it into something unreal just so everyone else can feel more comfortable." "Mrs." Tierney remained still, but something like respect flashed in her eyes. The man sighed and closed the papers again. "Then this is going to be very hard for you." June didn't look away. "It already is." He stood and left without another glance. Meanwhile, on the south side of the city, Barrett Kane called an emergency meeting in a closed room behind the restaurant the family used for conversations that were never meant to be recorded. 4 Kappa regimes sat around the table, their faces cold, their ears open. Barrett stood at the head of the table, confident in posture, measured in tone. "Reese is losing control," he said. "He's letting a street child influence his decisions. He ordered hospital security around in front of staff. He brought DCFS into our private business." He paused and let the silence do its work. "The allied families are watching. If they see us wavering, they won't wait to ask why." One of the Kappa regimes nodded slowly. "What do you want?" Barrett answered calmly. "I want the family council convened on emergency grounds to review his leadership within 48 hours. The room fell silent. No one objected. Barrett smiled thinly, the kind of smile with no warmth in it. Back at the hospital, Reese received a message from Pierce Alderman. The wording was brief, but it landed like a hammer. "Emergency Family Council meeting. 48 hours. Review of leadership capacity in light of the ongoing controversy." Reese read it once, then folded the paper carefully. He didn't flinch. He didn't slam his hand against anything. He folded it neatly and slipped it into his inner coat pocket, like a reminder that he understood the cost of every step that came next. Colette Ashford found him in the hospital garden soon after, the cold air cutting through the thin layer of her coat. Her expression was tight with restrained fury. "They're turning against you," she said without preamble. "I warned you." Reese didn't look up from the stone bench where he sat. "You warned me about humiliation," he replied. "Not about the truth." Colette crossed her arms. "Truth doesn't pay anyone's salary," she said. "Truth doesn't protect the child from becoming a symbol people gossip about." Reese looked up, his eyes both tired and sharp. "Our daughter is already a symbol," he said quietly. "A symbol of what happens when we choose comfort over courage." Colette looked at him as if he had spoken in a language she didn't understand. "You're choosing a strange child over your own family," she said in a flat voice. Reese stood and faced her. "No," he said. "I'm choosing family over fear." Colette stood there, caught off guard by the certainty in his voice. For a moment, something like doubt flickered through her eyes. Then it hardened. "I won't stand with you in this," she said flatly. Reese nodded. "I know," he answered. And between the two of them, the distance wasn't measured in steps, but in the truth one of them was willing to face, and the other refused to look at. By evening, the hospital no longer belonged to doctors or patients. It belonged to Image. The ballroom on the rooftop of the adjoining hotel along the Magnificent Mile glowed with soft amber light, crystal glasses touching in delicate notes as they were set upon tables draped in white linen. The banner at the entrance read, "The Callahan Foundation, Partners in Hope." It had been printed overnight, rushed and flawless, the kind of speed only money could buy. The invitations had gone out early that morning. Attendance was voluntary, which meant mandatory for anyone who wanted to be seen standing on the correct side. Reese Callahan stood at the edge of the room, adjusting his suit jacket while photographers tested their lenses. He felt like an actor who had missed rehearsal, stepping onto a stage where the script had already been agreed upon without him. Barrett Kane moved easily among the guests, shaking hands with donors, smiling faintly, reassuring board members with a hand at the elbow. He spoke the language of calm power with effortless fluency. "Tonight is about reassurance," Barrett murmured when he came near Reese. "We show stability, compassion, control." Reese's jaw hardened. "And the truth?" Barrett gave a thin smile. "The truth is flexible," he replied. "Confidence is what matters." Across the ballroom, Colette Ashford entered on the arm of a prominent investor. Her posture was perfect, her smile warm. She looked exactly like the woman she had trained herself to become, untouchable, without a crease anywhere. When she saw Reese, she gave a small nod, professional, distant. "Smile," she whispered as she passed him. "The cameras are rolling." Reese forced one onto his face. The MC tapped the microphone, and the room quieted. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, flashing a broad smile. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice. Tonight we honor resilience, compassion, the heart of the Callahan Foundation." Applause rose, warm and practiced. Reese stepped forward when his name was announced. He felt the lights burning hot against his face. The speech on the teleprompter scrolled smoothly, phrases chosen in advance for him: commitment to care, family values, unwavering leadership. And then Eloise entered the ballroom with Dr. Hale and a nurse. She looked tiny among the towering adults, her eyes darting around in alarm. The cameras turned toward her at once. "Joining us tonight," Reese continued, his voice steady though his chest was tightening, "is my daughter, Eloise." The applause swelled. Eloise flinched at the sound. She clung tightly to the nurse's hand, her eyes sweeping across the room in search of someone. She didn't see June. She didn't understand why June wasn't there. Panic moved across her face as fast as a passing shadow. Her lips trembled. A sharp cry burst from her, sudden and piercing, and heads turned. A ripple of whispers moved through the crowd. Barrett's smile faltered for exactly 1 second. Reese cut his speech short, stepped down, and crossed the room. He handed Eloise back to the nurse. "Take her upstairs," he said. "Right now." Then he turned to Barrett, his eyes burning. "You used my daughter as a shield," he said, his voice low enough for only Barrett to hear. Barrett didn't blink. "I protect the organization," he replied. "And I protect my daughter," Reese said through clenched teeth. "Move." The word carried weight. Barrett stepped aside, calculating. Down below, in the narrow service corridor in the hotel basement, where the air was heavy with the smell of bleach and old metal, June sat on a folding chair beside Mrs. Tierney. The sounds from above, music, laughter, drifted down through the vents like a cruel echo. "What's happening up there?" June asked softly. "A gala," Mrs. Tierney said. "For the donors." June frowned. "Because of me." Mrs. Tierney hesitated. "Because of what they want people to forget." June swallowed that. Her stomach had begun to hurt again. Hunger had returned with its hateful patience. A volunteer passed by and set a small plate of leftover food from the preparations on a nearby table. June looked at it, then looked away, ashamed of the instinct that rose inside her. Mrs. Tierney gently nudged the plate closer. "Eat," she said. "You're going to need your strength." June ate slowly, carefully, the way she always ate when food still didn't feel certain. Upstairs, in a private room away from the noise of the ballroom, Reese held Eloise in his arms. She had cried without sound until exhaustion took over, her hands gripping the fabric of his suit as if she were afraid of falling. The room was quiet. The light was dim and gold. Reese held her tighter, abandoning the gala, abandoning Barrett, abandoning everything else. Eloise lifted her head, her eyes red. She raised a hand to her throat, wincing with the effort, her brows drawing tightly together. She pushed air out, her jaw trembling, her face flushed red. Then, thin as a thread, broken but unmistakable, Eloise whispered, "Jew." "Nay." The room froze. Reese stopped breathing. Dr. Hale stood in the doorway, the clipboard in his hand dropping to his side. He looked at the little girl, then at Reese. Quiet astonishment, spreading across the seasoned face of a man who had witnessed thousands of cases. "She just said a name," he whispered. Reese didn't hide his tears. They ran freely, hot down his face, and he didn't turn away. For the first time in years, he cried in front of someone else, without feeling that it was weakness, because his daughter had just spoken. His daughter had just called the name of a homeless girl the whole world was trying to erase. And that wasn't weakness. It was the truest thing Reese Callahan had ever heard in his life. While the gala slowly died away and the guests departed with polite smiles, unaware that the polished surface of the evening had split open beyond repair, Petra Vaughn slipped into the hospital security room. She had waited until the night shift, when supervision was thinner and attention at its weakest. Her heart pounded, but her hands stayed steady as she sat before the monitor and began rewinding the footage from the pediatric corridor to the moment everything had happened. She had watched it once before and noticed something was wrong. Now she needed to be sure. The images ran backward, fast and then slow. Staff moving through the frame, shadows passing by. She stopped at the timestamp just after June had been dragged out of the corridor, the floor where the leaf had fallen. Petra zoomed in and slowed the recording frame by frame. And then she saw it. A gloved hand slipped into the frame, slow and deliberate. That hand picked up the dried leaf from the floor and replaced it with a different sample taken from a sealed bag. The move took less than 10 seconds, smooth as if it had been practiced. Petra zoomed in even farther. The logo on the glove came into view, blurred but readable, a small symbol she recognized immediately. It matched the private security company Barrett Kane regularly used for jobs the family didn't want directly tied to them. She checked the entry log. The timestamp matched exactly with an authorized access entry from Barrett's office, listed as outside security consultant. No specific name, only an ID code and an electronic signature leading straight back to the underboss. Petra leaned back in her chair as nausea rose inside her. She knew what it meant. This wasn't a mistake. It was staged. Someone had deliberately switched the evidence to turn June's harmless leaf into a weapon against her. She copied the entire footage, the access logs, and the timestamps onto a small USB drive, then pulled it out and hid it in her personal locker in the nurse's changing room. Her hands shook as she locked the door, but her eyes didn't. At the same time, Dr. Forrest Hale sat in his office with the phone pressed to his ear, listening to the results from the independent laboratory where he had sent the leaf sample for analysis. The technician's voice on the other end was calm but heavy. "The chemical composition doesn't match," the technician said. "The sample was contaminated with artificial impurities, compounds that don't occur naturally in any plant species." Dr. Hale asked, his voice careful. "Was it intentional?" There was a pause. "Yes," the technician confirmed. "This was deliberate interference." Dr. Hale thanked him and ended the call. He stared at the wall for a long moment before calling Reese. "They switched the sample," he said when Reese answered. "Science confirms it. Deliberate, artificial interference." Reese closed his eyes. "Can you prove it?" "I can," Dr. Hale replied. "And I will." Reese ended the call in silence. He sat beside Eloise's bed as she slept, looking at her small hand resting motionless on the white blanket, and felt something crack open inside his chest. Not a collapse, but an old wall finally coming down. But Barrett didn't stay still. By the next morning, before the sun had fully risen, he had already begun his counterattack. Calls were made to the underground media channels, the family controlled, nameless news pages with millions of views, anonymous accounts built to spread information on command. The narrative was planted carefully. Reese Callahan is losing control. The boss is being ruled by personal emotion. The Callahan empire is beginning to shake. Old photos were dug up. Comments were twisted out of shape. Anonymous sources quoted concerns about Reese's mental stability. The story wrote itself. Neat, directed, poisonous, but Barrett hadn't accounted for one thing. A nurse on the night shift in the pediatric wing, who had been there when Eloise whispered June's name in the private room, had accidentally recorded that moment on her phone. She hadn't meant to film it. She also couldn't bring herself to delete it. The clip was short, shaky, lit in pale gold, capturing the hoarse whisper of a 6-year-old girl forcing a name through her throat for the first time in her life. The caption was simple when it was posted online. The little girl they said was mute called her name. The clip spread faster than any story Barrett planted. It was shared, commented on, quoted, tagged. Public opinion shifted. Not slightly, but the way an entire building leans as it slowly begins to fall to one side. Barrett stared at the numbers on his screen, his jaw locked, his eyes dark. "Find out who posted that clip," he snapped at his assistant. The assistant hesitated. "Sir, it's already everywhere." Barrett slammed his phone down onto the desk. The screen shattered into a spiderweb of cracks, but he didn't look down. He looked out the window toward the Chicago skyline, where the city lights blinked with indifference above the storm spinning just below. And somewhere in that hospital, a silent 6-year-old girl had done what Barrett Kane's entire Underworld machine couldn't stop. She had spoken, and the whole world had heard her. Colette Ashford sat in her penthouse living room, with the curtains drawn tight, the only light coming from the phone screen replaying the clip the entire city was sharing. The image shook, the light was pale gold, and Eloise's hoarse whisper forced 2 syllables through her throat. Jew. Colette watched it the first time with disbelief, the second time with shock. By the third, her hand was trembling so badly she nearly dropped the phone. She turned off the screen and pressed her palm against her eyes. Her daughter had spoken. For the first time in 6 years, Eloise had made something that wasn't a cry or a breath. It was a name. And it wasn't Colette's. It wasn't Reese's. It was the name of the homeless girl she had stood in front of and called a street child. Colette felt something crack inside her chest, deeper than anger, deeper than humiliation. It was shame. And with that shame, memory came rushing back. 5 years earlier, Eloise was only 1 year old and still showed no sign of speaking. Dr. Hale had sent a detailed medical report to the family office, concluding that Eloise's mutism was not caused by physical damage. There was a strong chance of significant improvement if early intervention began with intensive emotional therapy, combined with a safe and consistent environment. That report never reached Reese. Barrett Kane intercepted it. Colette remembered that afternoon clearly, when Barrett had called her to his private office behind the restaurant the family used. He placed the report on the desk, gently, as if laying down a knife. Reese doesn't need to know about this, Barrett had said, his voice so calm it was frightening. Eloise is Reese's only weakness. If she improves, Reese won't need us to control the image, control the information, control the family narrative. He'll become more confident, more independent, harder to manage. Colette had looked at the report. She had understood every word in it. She had understood that her stepdaughter could have been helped sooner, better, more completely, and she had stayed silent. Not because she agreed with Barrett, but because she was afraid. Afraid of losing her place beside Reese. Afraid of being pushed out of the circle of power she had spent so many years forcing her way into. Afraid that if she spoke, Barrett would turn that blade toward her. So she swallowed the truth and buried it beneath lipstick, gowns, charity smiles, and perfect posture. 5 years. 5 years Eloise had sat inside silence when it might have been broken sooner if someone had been brave enough to say one sentence. Colette picked up the phone and called Barrett. Her voice was hard and sharp. "Stop," she said. "All of it. Stop right now." Barrett laughed softly on the other end, the laugh of a man who still believed he was winning. "It's too late, Colette. Everything is already in motion. You're hurting Eloise," Colette said, and even she was startled to hear her own voice shaking with anger instead of fear. "You're turning her into a sacrifice." Barrett was silent for a beat. Then his voice turned cold. Eloise became a sacrifice the moment Reese made the hospital incident public. "I didn't create this situation. I'm just managing it." Colette ended the call. Her hand was still shaking, but something had changed. The fear was still there. It didn't vanish just because she had decided to be brave. But now it was smaller than something else. Smaller than her daughter's whisper repeating in her mind without end. She called Reese. Her voice sounded different now, stripped bare, with no protective covering left. "We need to talk," she said. When they met in the hospital garden, Colette looked nothing like the woman Reese had grown used to. No perfect coat, no iron posture. Her eyes were swollen red, her hair uncombed, and the look on her face carried the weight of something that had been buried too long. "I was wrong," she said, her voice low but unwavering. "About that girl, about all of it." Reese looked at her, searching for deceit out of habit. He didn't find it. Colette went on. 5 years ago, Barrett hid a medical report. The report showed that Eloise could have improved if she'd received the right treatment sooner. He kept her mutism as leverage to control you, to make sure you would always need him to manage the image, manage the information, manage the family story. Reese stood still. Each word landed like a stone thrown into still water. "I knew," Colette said, tears running freely now. "I knew, and I stayed silent because I was afraid of losing everything. I was afraid of Barrett. I was afraid of being pushed outside. I chose my place over my daughter." She stopped and drew in a broken breath, but I heard her voice. I heard Eloise speak. Reese looked at her for a long time, a very long time. He didn't shout. He didn't slam his hand against anything. He didn't throw a single sharp word. He only said, "She said that girl's name." Colette nodded, the tears still falling. "I know," she whispered. "I'm ready to testify. About everything. About the report. About Barrett. About what I knew and chose to bury in silence." Reese nodded slowly. And between them, for the first time in years, silence wasn't a wall. It was the space where the truth finally had room to breathe. On the night before the hearing, the hospital sank into a fragile kind of quiet, like the thin skin of ice on Lake Michigan in early winter, solid at first glance, but ready to crack at any moment if someone stepped in the wrong place. Barrett Kane sat in a car parked 2 blocks from the hospital, the streetlights washing through the windshield and drawing streaks of light across his face. He called a number he rarely used. "Constantine," he said, when the voice on the other end answered. "We're running out of time. The girl is the catalyst for this entire uprising. If she disappears before tomorrow's council session, the emotional weight of their argument vanishes, and their narrative will collapse under its own weight." Konstantin Voronov listened in silence on the other end, the kind of silence that belonged to a man who had heard requests like this often enough not to need clarification. "I'll have people there within an hour," he replied, his voice flat as a tabletop. Barrett ended the call, smoothed his tie even though no one was there to see it, and drove away. 45 minutes later, 2 men in dark coats walked into the hospital lobby. They carried no identification anyone bothered to ask for. They went straight to the night reception desk and spoke in voices that were polite but left no room for refusal. "We need the location of the girl being held here under DCFS request. Juniper Wren." The night receptionist looked up and hesitated. "I'm not authorized to give out that information." One of the men leaned in and lowered his voice. "We're authorized by the legal office of the Callahan family." The receptionist opened her mouth to respond, but a nurse passing by overheard and quickly texted Petra Vaughn. Petra read the message, her heart jumping hard in her chest, and immediately called Mrs. Tierney. Mrs. Tierney didn't need to hear it twice. She had slept in an on-call room near June's temporary room, because she had the instinct of someone who had worked in child protection long enough to know that the night before, an important turning point was always the most dangerous. She opened the door to June's room and switched on the light softly. June sat upright at once, her eyes wide, the reflex of a child used to waking to trouble. "Put your shoes on, Mrs.," Tierney said, her voice calm but carrying an urgency she couldn't hide. "Right now." June didn't ask why. She slipped on her shoes in 3 seconds, her hands practiced in being ready to run. "What is it?" she asked as she stood. "Someone is asking where you are," Mrs. Tierney said. "This isn't an official procedure." June understood immediately. Her stomach tightened, but her legs didn't shake. She had been chased, grabbed, shoved, enough times in her life to know that trembling didn't help. "Where are we going?" she asked. Before Mrs. Tierney could answer, heavy footsteps echoed from the far end of the corridor. Not the footsteps of nurses, not the footsteps of patients, the footsteps of men who knew exactly where they were going and had no intention of stopping. Then, from the opposite direction, another group appeared. Reese Callahan strode forward, his coat thrown on in haste, his eyes sharp and fully awake despite the hour. Beside him were 4 men from the family's personal security detail. Not hired guards, but men who had sworn loyalty to Reese himself. He had called them the moment Petra warned him. The 2 groups met at the intersection of the corridor beneath fluorescent lights that flickered as if the hospital itself were holding its breath. Konstantin Voronov stood at the far end of the left corridor. His shadow stretched along the wall like a knife cut. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his face flat and unreadable. His eyes moved over Reese, over the security men, over Mrs. Tierney standing in front of June's door like a shield made of bone and flesh. For a few seconds, no one spoke. No guns were drawn. No fists were raised. There was only the stare-down between 2 forces in the dim corridor of a children's hospital at 2 o'clock in the morning, and the message passing through the silence was clearer than any spoken threat. Reese looked straight into Konstantin's eyes. He didn't blink. He didn't step back. He simply stood there between his daughter and the girl his daughter had named, and his presence said that if anyone wanted to touch either child in that building, they would have to go through him first. Konstantin understood the message. He was a practical man, not a reckless one. A direct confrontation with Callahan himself in a children's hospital in the middle of the night did not belong to any version of events that ended well. He gave a slow nod, then turned and walked away. The two men with him followed. Their heavy footsteps faded, then disappeared. The corridor exhaled. Mrs. Tierney loosened the hand she had clenched so tightly at her side without realizing it. June stood behind her, her eyes still alert, still ready to run, but her feet remained planted. Then a small sound came from behind Dr. Hale. Eloise was standing there, barefoot on the cold floor, her eyes sleepy and confused. She had woken to the noise and followed Dr. Hale into the corridor. Her eyes moved over the adults, then stopped on June. Her face softened, as if she had finally found what she had been searching for. "Ju. Ne," she whispered. The sound was tiny, hoarse, fragile enough to nearly disappear into her breath, but in that corridor, stretched tight only seconds before like a wire about to snap, it rang out more clearly than any order or threat exchanged moments earlier. Reese knelt beside his daughter and gathered her into his arms. "We're all safe," he said softly. He looked at June over Eloise's shoulder. She stood there, thin inside her torn coat, her worn shoes only half fastened in haste, and eyes that had seen far too much for a 12-year-old child. But she didn't cry. She only nodded, once, gently, as if she understood that safety wasn't something someone promised you. It was something you had to stand in the middle of and hold on to yourself. On the morning of the hearing, the city wore a different kind of air, sharper, stiller, as if Chicago itself were leaning in to listen. Rain threatened from the low-hanging clouds above Little Italy, where the old red brick buildings stood shoulder to shoulder like old men guarding secrets. The Italian restaurant on the corner looked ordinary from the outside. Dark wood facade, curtains drawn across the windows, a hand-painted sign faded by time. But the basement beneath it was where the real decisions of Chicago's underworld had been made for 4 decades. A stone staircase led down into a wide room with a low ceiling, exposed brick walls, yellow lights, and a long oak table polished smooth by time. The smell of red wine and old wood blended into an air so thick it felt heavy with power. Don Emilio Fiore sat at the head of the table, 72 years old, white hair brushed back, hands folded before him. He didn't need to raise his voice to make people fall silent. His presence was command enough. Every word he spoke carried the weight of decades, of blood spilled and agreements kept. And everyone in that room understood that when Don Emilio opened his mouth, history was listening. The Kappa regimes and representatives of allied families entered one by one, taking their seats with cold faces and watchful eyes. Lawyers, advisors, note-takers. No one filmed, no one recorded. In this room, words were worth as much as lives. Reese Callahan arrived early, shoulders straight, eyes steady. He sat without display, without looking at anyone in particular, simply placing both hands on the table and waiting. Barrett Kane arrived last. His suit was perfect as always, but something in his posture had changed, a subtle rigidity that only those who knew to look would notice. He nodded to Don Emilio, nodded to Reese, nodded to the delegates, each gesture measured. Then he sat down across from Reese. Their eyes met for one brief moment, control facing determination, before both men looked away. Don Emilio opened the session in a voice low and slow. "We are here to review allegations of obstruction, evidence tampering, and abuse of power within the organization. Witnesses will speak in order." Petra Vaughn was called first. She stepped to the head of the table with her chin lifted, her hands trembling only slightly. She spoke clearly and carefully about the security footage, the access logs, the timestamps. She described the gloved hand slipping into frame, the leaf being picked up and replaced with a different sample. She presented the logo on the glove matching the private security company Barrett often used, and the entry authorized by his own office. Barrett's lawyer rose smoothly. "Miss Vaughn," he said, "you are not trained in forensic analysis, correct?" "No," Petra replied. "Then your interpretation is speculation." "I know what I saw," Petra said, her eyes never leaving his. "And I documented all of it." Don Emilio gave a small nod, his face unreadable. "Proceed," he said. Dr. Forrest Hale was called next. He presented the independent laboratory findings, with the precision of a man who had spent his life in science. He explained the chemical composition of the leaf sample, the artificial contaminants not found in nature, the deliberate interference. This was not an accident, he concluded. The sample was altered after collection. Barrett's lawyer leaned forward. "Doctor, are you asserting intent?" I am asserting evidence, Doctor, Hale replied calmly. Intent is the logical consequence. The room fell silent for a beat. Don Emilio said nothing, but his eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. Then June was called. The room changed when she stood. She walked slowly, her heart beating like a drum inside her chest. The microphone felt too close. The yellow light felt hot on her skin. June focused on the calm face of Mrs. Tierney seated in the front row. Tell us what happened, Don Emilio said, his voice gentler when he spoke to her. June took a breath. I saw a little girl who looked scared, she said. She couldn't talk. Everyone around her was laughing. I had a leaf. I gave it to her. I didn't know if it would help. I just didn't want her to be alone. Barrett's lawyer stood up. You admit that you trespassed. Yes, June answered. I shouldn't have gone inside. And you gave the girl a substance from an unknown source? June shook her head. It wasn't strange to me. The lawyer gave a thin smile. But you are not a doctor. June swallowed. Her voice shook, but it didn't break. No, she said. I'm only a little girl. That sentence fell heavily into the basement room, where bosses and lawyers sat in expensive suits. It was too simple to dismiss, too honest to twist, and it hung in the air longer than any legal argument that had been offered before it. June's words were still hanging in the air when Colette Ashford rose to her feet. A murmur moved through the basement room like ripples over still water. No one had expected this. Colette, the woman who had always stood on the side of image, always chosen control, always kept her distance from anything that might stain the polished surface she had spent years constructing, was now standing before the family council and asking to testify. I have information the council needs to hear, she said, her voice steadier than she had believed it could be. Don Emilio looked at her for a long beat, then nodded. Granted, he said simply. Colette walked to the head of the table, her eyes moving across the room before stopping on Reese for one brief moment, searching for something to hold on to. Then she began. I put image before truth for years, she said. I told myself it was to protect my daughter, but it wasn't. It was fear. She told them about the medical report from 5 years earlier, the one concluding that Eloise had a real chance of improvement if intervention began early. She told them how Barrett had intercepted that report and kept it as leverage, turning Eloise's silence into a tool for controlling Reese. She told them about the meeting in the office behind the restaurant, Barrett's voice calm as he explained why Reese didn't need to know, and she told them that she had known. She had known from the beginning, and chosen silence because she was afraid of losing her place beside the most powerful man in half the city. 5 years, Colette said, her voice breaking for the first time. 5 years the child in my care sat in silence when it might have been broken sooner. Barrett shot to his feet, his chair scraping sharply across the stone floor. This is personal revenge, he said, his voice cutting. A discarded wife trying to destroy the man who gave her everything. The room shifted. A few eyes moved from Colette to Barrett, measuring, weighing. Then Reese stood. He didn't rise quickly. He rose slowly, deliberately, like a man who had thought carefully about every word he was about to say. No, he said, his voice calm but sharp enough to cut through every whisper in the room. This isn't revenge. This is a family choosing truth. Barrett opened his mouth to speak again, but Don Emilio lifted a hand, one small gesture carrying absolute weight. Barrett closed his mouth. I have documents, Colette continued, tears falling freely now, though she didn't wipe them away, and I'm willing to submit all of them. Don Emilio gave a nod to the clerk. Enter them into record, he said. Then he turned toward the door. Final witness, he said. The basement door opened. Dr. Hale entered first, leading Eloise by the hand. She wore a soft sweater, her hair brushed neatly, and she carried the crayon drawing she had brought from the hospital. She looked heartbreakingly small in a room full of men in black suits beneath those heavy yellow lights. The room went completely still. Eloise's wide eyes moved across the unfamiliar faces, the tall shadows, the strange lights. Fear crossed her face as quickly as a cloud shadow. Then she found June. June was standing at the back of the room beside Mrs. Tierney, both hands clasped tightly in front of her chest. Eloise's face changed. The fear melted away. Her eyes lit up with a smile so sudden it seemed to pull all the air from the room. June, she said, not a whisper, not a broken breath, but a name, clearer than any time before, spoken with the full force of a child who had been silent for 6 years and had finally found a reason to try. A collective intake of breath moved through the room. Don Emilio leaned forward. Eloise walked toward the table in small, careful steps. She placed the crayon drawing on the polished oak surface. A figure with long hair colored green. A small circle near the chest. She pointed to the circle, then touched her own throat, then pointed at June. Dr. Hale spoke softly. She's connecting June with safety, with permission to use her voice. Barrett stood again. This is emotional manipulation, he snapped. A child can't be used as evidence. Don Emilio looked at him. Eyes shaped by 72 years didn't blink. Sit down, he said, his voice low as distant thunder. Right now. Barrett sat. The whole room heard the chair hit the floor. Don Emilio looked at Eloise for another moment, then spoke gently. Thank you, child. That is enough. Doctor. Hale led Eloise out. When the door closed, the sound of her voice still seemed to echo through the room, like a bell not yet finished ringing. The council withdrew to deliberate. The minutes stretched like hours. When they returned, Don Emilio's face was set in stone. The evidence is sufficiently clear, he said. Obstruction, evidence tampering, abuse of power, concealment of medical information causing direct harm to a family member. Barrett Kane is stripped of all rank and expelled from the organization. Further disposition will be decided later. Barrett opened his mouth, but for a long moment, no sound could escape. For the first time in his life, the man who always had an answer for everything found himself paralyzed by a deafening silence as his world crumbled around him. Two men stepped to either side of him. Barrett looked at Reese, his eyes full of hatred and something close to disbelief. You're destroying everything we built, he said hoarsely. Reese met his gaze without looking away. You destroyed it. We're rebuilding it. Barrett was escorted out of the room. The room parted around him like water around a sinking stone. No one looked after him. No one said goodbye, and in the heavy silence that remained, Don Emilio looked at Reese for a long time and gave a single nod. Only once. But in this world, one nod from Don Emilio Fiore was worth more than every contract ever signed in ink. The days after the hearing passed with a strange kind of quiet. The kind that comes after a storm when the air still carries static but the sky has begun to clear. Barrett Kane was removed from every part of the organization within 24 hours. His office on the south side of the city was sealed, his files seized, his passwords changed. The men who had once nodded along with him in meeting rooms now looked away when his name was spoken, displaying the same polished indifference with which they had once obeyed his every command. Konstantin Voronov left Chicago on an early morning flight with no name on the passenger list, vanishing as quietly as he had arrived. The Allied families watched, waited, measured. Then, one by one, they returned to cooperation when they saw that Reese Callahan had not collapsed but had become steadier, not because he was stronger than before, but because for the first time, he wasn't pretending. Eloise improved, but not in the way movies like to tell it. There was no morning when she woke up and suddenly began speaking with ease. Progress came inch by inch, painful and slow. First came single sounds, rough and strained, costing her enough effort to turn her face red. Then came syllables joined together, trembling but intentional. Then came names, and always. The first name was June. Doctor. Hale reminded them in every therapy session with the calm voice of a man who had seen too many hopes placed in the wrong place. This isn't a miracle, he said. This is work. And there were days when the sound retreated. There were mornings when Eloise opened her mouth and nothing came out. Frustration twisting her small face. Tears rolling down in silence. No one pretended those days didn't exist. Reese sat beside his daughter on mornings like that, not urging, not comforting her with empty promises. He simply sat there, holding her hand, and waited. Sometimes waiting was all he could do, and he was learning to accept that this, too, was enough. Petra Vaughn received her official termination letter from the hospital 2 days after the hearing. Violation of procedure, misuse of security system access. The language in the letter was designed to sound neutral, but it cut deep as a blade. She finished reading it, folded it carefully, and set it on the table. When Reese came to find her, Petra gave a slight shrug. Jobs can be replaced, she said. A conscience can't. Reese nodded. I'm creating a new internal oversight division for the organization, he said. It will review transparency and stop abuses of power from within. I want you to run it. Petra blinked, genuinely surprised. You don't owe me anything. I owe the system repair, Reese replied. Petra nodded slowly. emotion tightening her throat. Then I'll do it the right way. Colette came to visit Eloise one afternoon when the winter sunlight filtered through the hospital window, weak but warm. She didn't call ahead. She didn't bring gifts. She wasn't carefully made up. She simply stood in the doorway, stripped of all her old armor, and looked at her daughter sitting on the bed with her drawing. Eloise looked up, saw Colette, and froze for a moment. Uncertainty passed over her face. Not fear, but hesitation. The kind of hesitation a child feels when deciding whether it is safe to trust. Colette knelt down slowly, keeping her distance. "Hello, sweetheart," she said, her voice trembling despite all her effort. Eloise looked at her stepmother, then at the picture she was drawing, then back at Colette. She leaned slightly toward Colette, just a little. Enough to be noticed, but not enough to be called an embrace. Then she pulled back again. Colette didn't push. Tears ran freely down her face, but the smile that came to her lips was the truest smile she had worn in years. "I'll wait," she whispered. "However long it takes. I'll wait. Mrs. Tierney completed all the paperwork to protect June in the following week. Temporary guardianship, public school enrollment, counseling appointments, no cameras, no media interviews, no one allowed near the girl without child protection approval. "She is not a symbol, Mrs." Tierney said firmly to the hospital administration. "She is a child," and this time, no one argued. June was placed in temporary housing at a nonprofit shelter, a shared room, shared rules, shared laughter. She struggled. The bed not moving unsettled her through those first nights. Her body so used to being ready to run that it didn't know how to lie still in one fixed place. The meals arriving on schedule frightened her in a way no one expected, because when food was always there, she didn't know how much to eat, didn't know how much to save, didn't know whether it would still be there tomorrow. Fear didn't disappear overnight. Hunger didn't either. But slowly as winter gives way to spring in Chicago, the city began to feel less like an enemy. One afternoon, on the grass behind the hospital where the snow had melted into small shining pools beneath the pale sun, June read aloud from a picture book to Eloise. She read slowly, carefully, her finger following each word. Eloise sat beside her, drawing with crayons, glancing up now and then to listen. Then Eloise looked at a picture in the book, a green leaf against a white background. She pointed to the picture, then touched her throat, then looked at June, and said, "Leaf." The word came out imperfectly, a little bent, a little hoarse, but clear and deliberate. June went still. The book slipped from her hands. She looked at Eloise, her eyes wide. Eloise pointed to the picture again, then touched her throat, patiently repeating it. "Leaf." June laughed. It burst out through tears, sudden and uncontrollable, and she had no wish to control it. She nodded, her voice thick. "That's right," she whispered. "Leaf." And Reese stood a few steps away, hearing everything, and forgot to breathe. A few weeks after that afternoon when Eloise said the word leaf on the hospital lawn, Reese found June in the courtyard where everything had begun. The cracked sidewalk was still there, the weeds still pushing up through the seams in the concrete. The invisible border between two worlds still existed, though now it had grown far thinner than before. June sat on the familiar stone bench reading a book Mrs. Tierney had bought for her, her new shoes still stiff because she hadn't worn them long enough yet to soften them. She looked up when she saw Reese approaching, and that instinctive flash of caution passed through her eyes before she could hide it. Reese sat down across from her, both hands resting on his knees, not rushing. He looked at her for a long moment and then said, "I want to ask you something." June set the book down and waited. Reese took a breath. "I want to adopt you," he said, officially, legally, not because I owe you, not because of guilt, not because of the media or appearances, but because my daughter needs you, and because you deserve a family. June didn't answer right away. She looked down at her hands, those thin fingers that only a few weeks earlier had been digging through trash cans looking for food. Then she looked up, and in her eyes was something Reese had learned to recognize, not gratitude, but evaluation. She was weighing him, measuring him, deciding whether he could be trusted. "I don't want to be owned," June said, her voice quiet but steady, "or used. I won't lie for you, and I won't smile for cameras." Reese felt a smile lift at the corner of his mouth. And for the first time that smile carried none of the weight of power or calculation. "Then we're alike," he said. June studied his face a little longer, searching for hidden strings, for unspoken conditions. She didn't find them. I agree, she said slowly, but I don't want to forget where I came from, or the children who are still out there on the streets. I won't become someone who pretends she's never been hungry. Rhys nodded. You won't forget, he answered, and you won't have to face any of it alone. They sat in silence for a while, and this time silence wasn't a wall or an emptiness. It was a beginning. A few weeks after that, on a quiet evening when Chicago softened beneath the last sunset of winter, the three of them returned to the hospital courtyard, the cracked sidewalk, the border between shadow and glass, the patch of grass where June had once sat, curled up waiting for leftovers, and Eloise had once stared out from the other side of the window. Eloise stood between Rhys and June, holding both their hands. Her left hand held her father's, her right hand held the girl who had placed the bitter leaf in her palm and changed everything. She looked up at June, then up at Rhys. She took a deep breath, her chest rising, her eyes focused with an effort only those who had witnessed her journey could truly understand. June, she said. Clear, warm, no longer trembling. Then, after a long pause, carefully, as if she were building a bridge, one brick at a time, she said, Papa. Rhys dropped to his knees. Laughter and tears broke out at once. Uncontrolled, unashamed, unhidden. He pulled both children into his arms, one hand around his daughter, one hand around the little girl who was now his daughter too. June held tightly to Eloise's hand, smiling through tears of her own. She wasn't crying from sadness. She was crying because for the first time in a very long while, she didn't need to be ready to run. The city moved around them, indifferent and immense. Traffic roared, streetlights flickered, the wind off Lake Michigan carried its familiar cold. But in that small space, on the cracked pavement where two worlds had once been separated by a pane of glass, something unbreakable had taken root. Not a miracle, not charity, just the truth. Finally spoken aloud. Sometimes the world doesn't change because of power, money, or loud voices. Sometimes it changes because of one small act that refuses to stay hidden in the dark. June didn't help Eloise because she believed she would be rewarded. She helped because she recognized fear in another human being and chose not to turn away. That choice nearly cost her her freedom, but it also exposed what the system had tried to bury, that the truth can't be controlled forever. Eloise's journey reminds us that healing never happens instantly. Her voice didn't come back like magic. It came little by little, painfully, through effort, fear, and trust. And Rhys's transformation teaches us that real responsibility doesn't live in image. It lives in courage. Even the most powerful man can choose differently when he finally sees that his child isn't a weakness to hide, but a human being who needs to be heard. This story also asks a gentle question that isn't easy to answer. Every day, how many voices do we ignore simply because they come from people we have already decided don't matter? How many Junes are sitting outside the glass, waiting to be seen? If this story made you feel something, even if it was only a moment of pause and reflection, please share it with us in the comments below. Which part stayed with you the longest? Where are you watching from? And what in your real life did this story bring to mind? We truly want to hear what you feel deep in your heart. If you believe stories about kindness, courage, and truth deserve to be told, please press the like button, share this video with someone you love, and subscribe to our channel so you won't miss our new stories every day. We wish all of you watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace in every day. Thank you for staying with us until the very last minute. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.